Welcome to Order Militaris Radio TV, and today's topic is a big one. Napoleon Bonaparte. Who is this guy? How evil was he? And why Catholics should not imitate him? We welcome back again Brother Alexis Bonello, and we are airing live on Order Militaris Radio TV.
Thank you, AJ. It's always great to be back on Order Militaris Radio TV, breaking new grounds in independent Catholic media, and certainly something the English-speaking world needs. It has very little independent Catholic media. So this is a great apostle that you're doing. I want to thank you again as a member of the Order. Inspires other members around the world to start taking decisive action to defend the rights of Christians who are being persecuted and to make known all the problems we find ourselves in today. And so many of them come from the French Revolution.
Yeah. We have a major factor regarding what's all going on today. And yeah, let's begin. Who is Napoleon Bonaparte?
Napoleon Bonaparte, as we say in English, although he's from Corsica, so I think maybe they would say Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte. Corsica is that big island right to the southeast of the French coast, north of Sardinia. It's a very rugged mountainous island. Generally, the people there have been very poor. If you've ever flown on it, it's quite a sight. It's not that big of an island. I'd say it's probably not even as big as Long Island. But known for a lot of internecine war, because when you're on a small island, there's small resources, there's a lot of fights on it. And Napoleon came from, I'd say, a lower nobility. And he was born on August 15th, 1769. And being a Franciscan and devoted to Our Lady, I can't avoid remarking about the date of his birth. He was born on the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which is a unique feast about the exaltation of Our Lady to the right hand of God. Has to do with monarchy, has to do with power. But has to do also to the reward of someone who is extremely humble and extremely faithful to Our Lady. And as we will see with Bonaparte, he was kind of like the opposite. Well, he was an extremely proud man. He was a man of little faith. He raged against the world. He raged against the papacy, and he raged against God. And in his age, I'd have to say he was probably the most famous of all men. And yet he failed in everything he attempted. And in the end, he repented of what he did and converted back to the Catholic faith, and hopefully at least made it to purgatory. Okay, so we're talking about a man who was a man of many sins and yet much repentance. And he died on the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic on the 5th of May, 1821. So he was born in one island and died in another. He was born in Liberty as a nobleman. He died in prison, in an English prison, in one of the most isolated prisons on the face of the earth. Even today, you can't get to St. Helena by plane. You have to take a boat from, I think, Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and it's like a, I don't know, 20, 18-hour voyage, because it's out in the middle of nowhere. He spent his childhood in Corsica, and in 1778, he entered the College of Autun. In 1779, he entered the military school of Brienne. So we're still under the French monarchy. Okay, AJ, your relative there, Louis, is still king of France, and the French society doesn't know what's about to hit it. In 1783, he attended the military school at Paris. So he was trained to be an officer in the French Royal Army, whose flag was white with golden fleur-de-lis upon it. Okay. In 1785, when he was assigned to the garrison of Valence as lieutenant, he occupied his leisure with researches into the history of his land, his homeland, Corsica, and he read many philosophers of his times. He studied. His studies left him attached to sort of deism. Deism was very popular in that age among those who didn't want to be Catholics and yet didn't want to shame themselves by saying they were atheists. Deism is the idea that God created the world and kind of like a clock maker left it to be on its own. Deists didn't deny there was divine action in the world and divine providence other than the way God made the world. So deism plays an important part in the role because you see now, once he decides to become a deist, he abandons almost all morality and he tries to be like God himself, and all fails because deism is a grave error, because God not only made the world, he rules the world, and at every moment he rules the world, and no one will snatch this world out of our Lord's hands. The plans of his heart are from age to age, as it says in Scripture. So he gave up his Catholic religion, and he took on the prejudices of his age, railing against priesthood, the fact that priests would govern over anything or any kinds of theocracy. Because you have to remember that in the Ancien Régime, they said, the ancient regime, you might see it written in English, it looks like that. Not only did the King of France rule France and the nobility own most of the land, the church owned about a tenth of the land in France, and the bishops were powerful landowners who had the right to raise armies and govern territories and administer justice. So your bishop wasn't just someone who governed the priests and the churches of your diocese. He also had troops and lands, and he might have been even the landowner that you paid rent to. Okay, it was not a position of just religious authority. It accompanied also civil authority. And the clergy regularly advised the nobility and the kings of France in all matters of state, not only religion, even questions of things like taxation and foreign affairs. So that was the age in which Napoleon was born. So obviously, being from the nobility and an officer in the army, there was really nothing in the old regime he could do. He could rise in rank, but not so high, because the high ranks were given to the high nobility. And there wasn't much social movement. And that's one of the differences we have now with the post-French Revolution societies. It is said almost anyone could rise to any level, but the truth is you can only do it if you kowtow to the Masonic order, which is the real authority in the post-French Revolutionary era. He showed himself from the beginning of his military career as an absolute military genius, okay? And he did it in this way. He's 24 years old, and he was assigned to the forces of the French Royal Army, which were to expel the English from Toulon, because England and France had been at war. The English troops landed on the south coast at Toulon, which is the major port of the French Navy in the Mediterranean. Okay, so it's an extremely strategic point, and the British, by capturing it, were preventing the Kingdom of France of rebuilding its navy and restoring its naval power. So it had to be taken back. And what he did was he massed all his artillery at one strategic point above the city and started bombarding the British until they had to release and forcing them to withdraw from the city lest they be destroyed. It's one of the first mass uses of artillery, and it was a brilliant strategy, because from those heights he could not be attacked, and he had the better position. So, and he was always a military commander who knew that if you're going to win the battle, you must choose the ground on which to fight, and always the favorable ground. He was so brilliant at this that he often planned his military victories months in advance on a map in his office, because he knew that on a certain field in a certain place he could win a battle against almost anyone. So he would often lure the opponent to move his armies onto that field, and then he would attack him. So this was something he planned months in advance, and even before the enemy had his armies on the field. He was brilliant from that point of view. He knew not to waste his forces just anywhere. He wasn't a man who, by whim, decided to fight. Okay, he chose his battles. He fought to win. He didn't fight to fight, and he didn't fight to oppose his enemy. He fought to defeat his enemy. So from that point of view, he was an extremely self-controlled man. He was extremely prudent man. He was extremely clever, and he is not the kind of we haven't seen in Europe a man like him since perhaps the time of Julius Caesar. Okay, since both at the beginning of their lives were relatively low in station, and both by conquering large territories rose to the very heights of power. Although he showed himself far more adept in political maneuvers than even Julius Caesar. So I have to say that in the history of Europe, in the last 2,000 years, he's a rather unusual figure, since he had expertise in almost every human endeavor. And because of that, he has become almost like an idol to admire. I think certainly most Frenchmen admire Napoleon, and some actually think that he is the end all of anything, the greatest Frenchman that ever lived, even though he was Corsican. He wasn't really French. And even though he brought an end to the French Revolution, because remember, the purpose of the French Revolution was to free the peasants and overthrow the monarchical order, but the end becomes so chaotic that eventually Napoleon will seize all power and set himself up as emperor, claiming more authority and power than the French kings ever had.
So he went from the French army, and he joined the Italian army?
No, well, once the revolution breaks out, the army switches its allegiance over to the revolutionaries. So he never served in the Italian army. He always served in the French army, but it went from being loyal to the king to loyal to the revolution. So his fame at the Battle of Toulon merited him promotion by the revolutionaries, because the revolutionaries who were toppling the French monarchy knew very well, they were very pragmatic people, that if you didn't have the best generals on your side, you would lose. And so it was either recruit Napoleon for yourselves or fear that he might go over to the Royalists, which probably he wouldn't have done because he was of Republican sympathies. Republican in this sense means in favor of the revolution. He was made a general brigade in the artillery after Toulon, and he fought with Massena in Italy, contributing to his victories. And he was assigned in 1794 to suppress the Vendée rebellion. So the Vendée rebellion was, perhaps we'll do a program about this someday, was the Catholics in Western France who were not going to have anything to do with the revolution and were loyal supporters of the king and the Catholic clergy. And the central government wanted them suppressed, crushed, and genocided, is what happened. And they asked Napoleon to be one of the generals, and he would have nothing of it. His sense of closeness to the Catholic people and his deep sentiment, I mean, in his sentiments, he was still a Catholic, even though intellectually and willfully he didn't follow the religion. Yet he remained a man of strong Catholic sentiment. So he said he got sick and he couldn't take the command, and the revolutionaries didn't like that from that because they wanted vicious, bloodthirsty people. But it's from this point on we see that he starts taking a slightly different direction from the revolution, because the revolutionaries wanted to destroy, and all chaos is breaking down. But he starts making decisions of not choosing the ultimate chaos, choosing the side of having some order, some moderation, some sort of tolerance, okay? Which I think really was of his character. It wasn't a political decision. It was just that, as most Frenchmen were not in favor of the revolution, it was executed by a vicious minority of non-Catholics, Masons, and individuals who sought to gain, because in the French regime, in the Ancien regime, they would have no place since they were not Catholic or of the high nobility.
Yeah, I was just watching an old, I don't know how old, but mid 2000s miniseries from HBO on called John Adams. And right during the French Revolution, the Republicans of that are running the revolution in France come over when George Washington was president and was stirring up a little bit of trouble in America as well. And their so-called ambassador meets with George Washington as president and asks him not so politely to get on board with the revolution. And George Washington said, "Sir, don't you even dare, or I will unleash on you." George
Yeah,
Washington, George didn't want to get into a fight, but if he had to, he's going to kick some rear end.
yeah. The French Revolution, though they claimed it was inspired by the American Revolution, wasn't at all the case. The American Revolution was organized by mostly the mercantile class in the United States who wanted prosperity and equal rights. Whereas the French Revolution was orchestrated by the Grand Orient of Paris, the Masonic Lodge, and all anti-Catholic forces at Paris, and it really spread from Paris, okay? And it was atheistic, it was anti-Catholic, and it tried to create its own calendar, its own religion, its own new societal order, okay? So it was an attack on the culture, the politics, the government, the religion, and the traditions of France. It was an anti-French revolution, whereas the American Revolution didn't attack any of those things. It only attacked the British claim to taxation, okay? And it subsequently led to a war of independence. But no one changed their religion. No one changed the government. The governments of all the colonies remained the same and still in existence. No colonial government was overthrown. No churches were burnt because they were churches, and no one was out to attack Christianity or any other religion in the American Revolution. American Revolution, from that point of view, was highly principled, and it was very limited in its scope and in its intentions. And that's why the American Revolution left the United States with a culture intact, and one which was just as acceptable before as after. If anything, there was an amelioration, because with the introduction of the United States, Roman Catholicism becomes a legal religion in the United States, whereas before it was illegal under King George. So there's a lot more religious tolerance after the American Revolution. But with the French Revolution, as it breaks out, you have thousands of Catholic priests put to death. You have a whole number of laws about stealing church land, controlling the appointment of bishops, and wresting from Christianity its authority in society and morality and the family and the government and the state and the culture. So it's entirely two different things. There's no way you can compare the American Revolution to the French Revolution. One was about political liberty. The other was about destroying Christendom, okay? Mm-hmm. And the French Revolution becomes the archetype for all Masonic revolutions thereafter. And this is because the Masonic Lodge of France has always been extremely anti-Christian in its conception and in its goals, even to this day.
You're listening to Order Militaris Radio TV live on air, and you will be watching the program later on up on YouTube and BitChute. If you like what you're hearing, please go to ordo-militaris.net and click on any of the show topics. When you scroll down, you will see a free will monthly subscription to Order Militaris Radio TV. Then you see the blue-green button at the bottom, make a monthly pledge of support. Click that, follow the directions, and you'll be able to support us that way. And you also see on top of our bar, on the menu bar, Order Militaris Radio Store. That is our Teespring store. Go there, get you some merchandise. Everything goes back to Order Militaris Catholicus. It comes right back into this apostolate. And there's also a way to get that flag behind Brother Alexis.
Yeah, so if you buy one of these flags, you're going to help the apostolate grow. Neither AJ nor I get any salary. We do what we do, a nonprofit for the cause of defending Christians. And Ordo Militaris Inc., the company founded by members of Ordo Militaris Catholicus around the world, we had this historic design of the battle flag of Marco Antonio Colonna from the Battle of Lepanto. He raised it at noon on that day as the signal to the Catholic forces. And it shows the cross of Christ and the shields of Venice, the papacy, Spain, and Don Juan of Austria. They're at the foot of the cross, showing that the forces acknowledged Christ's supremacy and that they would fight under the power and merits of his passion. And with the rosary being prayed by all Christendom for this battle, so it's also, I say it's also the Our Lady of Victory's battle, because to a victor of a battle goes the trophies. And certainly this banner of Marco Antonio Colonna, which was the one that opened the battle, which was victorious by the intercession of Our Lady, is intimately tied historically with Our Lady of the Rosary, Our Lady of the Victories for the rest of time. So we sell historical reproduction that's 1 meter by 1.5 meters, printed on nylon. It's in full color. It can get wet. You can fly it on your ship, your boat, from your porch, from your flagpole, to show that you're really Catholic, not just claim Catholic. This is a flag for militant Catholics, and it's beautiful in its historical detail. And if you buy one of these flags, tell AJ you bought it because you were listening to Ordo Militaris Radio TV or watching, and half the proceeds will go to the apostolate, so that we can get some better software for the site, get better distribution for the radio signal, and start spreading it around the internet, so that the catechetical programs or the informative programs that we do will help Catholics everywhere become and remain true and faithful to Christ in all our times against all enemies, okay? And to get to know better how much Christians are suffering around the world and what they can do to help. That's the purpose of this station. So the station has a nonprofit goal to it. And you could call it's a religious apostolate, though it's not run by a religious order. Ordo Militaris Catholicus is an international association of Catholics for the defense of Christians. And it has a level of, you would say, a pious association. Although our goal is not our personal sanctification, it's a work of mercy towards those most in need. So Ordo Militaris Inc. sells this flag, ordo-militaris.us. So it's like the radio station, but it's .us.net, where you can get one of these flags if you go to shop and then flags, and you can get one with a credit card through our Stripe account.
So you were speaking about how very evil the French Revolution was, and how they wanted to destroy everything, and how Napoleon didn't want to take part in the destruction of the Vendée.
No, he didn't do that. But what he was willing to do in 1795 is fire some grape shot on a crowd of revolutionaries in Paris who opposed the revolutionary government had taken control, because as the revolution goes on, one group after another takes control in Paris, because the whole concept was to break down power, and so constantly every group was trying to seize it. So in the mid-1790s, the ones that came to power were calling themselves the Directory, and they were having some trouble controlling the Parisian mob. So they asked Bonaparte to do something about it, and he put his artillery on top of a roof of a church, and he fired it into the crowd, but with restraint. So he did what the government said, and yet he didn't really lose favor among the people. So with that, they give him much more important military duties. And at this point, the great powers of Europe, who are run by monarchies, have decided that something must be done about France, or chaos is going to break out throughout Europe. So there was a general idea from all the monarchies, whether England, Spain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, that something has to be done about France. So the first coalition was the coalition of some of those monarchies against the French Revolution. And Napoleon was dispatched to Italy to fight for the French cause. And he was commander-in-chief in this military thing. So his victory at Montenotte over the Austrians, commanded by their general Bellieu, and those of Millesimo, Diego Cerva, and Mondovi over Colle's Piemontese troops forced Victor Amadeus, King of Sardinia, to conclude the first treaty with the French at Armistice of Cherasco. And the Kingdom of Savoy was this small colony kingdom on the French border in northern Italy. We'd say Piedmont today, Turin was its capital. So it was a necessary first battle. And by this treaty, they submit and become a satellite state of France. Wishing to effect a junction on the Danube with the army of the Rhine, Napoleon spent the following May in driving the Austrian general Bellieu across northern Italy and pushed him back into the Tyrol. And on the 7th of May of that year, 1796, he left half his troops in Lombardy, and then with the other half marched again to take the Italian peninsula. So he was ordered to take the Italian peninsula, but he didn't want to share his glory with someone else, so he balked on that. He was always one to never put himself on the level of equality with those he believed were his inferiors. Okay, he was not a humble man for anything, and he was extremely ambitious. So he always was manipulating the situation in his command so that he'd have the most power. So the French troops invaded the Papal States, and the Pope signed an armistice with the French. In the Peace of Bologna on the 23rd of June that year, the Holy See gave up its possessions at Bologna and Ferrara, and the French occupied those territories. And the Pope paid the French government 21 million francs in indemnities and handed over works of art and manuscripts. The government in Paris, which was outrageously anti-Catholic, didn't like these really lenient terms that Napoleon was managing. But Napoleon was very pragmatic. He knew he controlled the armies in the field. The revolutionary government was far away in Paris, and since treaties were made in the field, he was going to make the treaties that he liked. So from this point on, basically Napoleon becomes an independent operator, which is something that would be impossible in an actual government. But in the revolution, there's really no law and order, so whoever snatches the power has it. And he understood that principle. So he starts snatching all the power he can, and he never really lets anyone tell him what to do after this. He goes on to win almost every battle he's involved in. And because of that, his fame now starts rising among the French people, because week after week, month after month, all they hear is Napoleon wins, Napoleon wins, Napoleon wins. So the mobs just loved him and cheered his name. He became extremely famous in France and extremely feared in Europe, because no one could figure out why he's winning all these battles. And the easy thing was, besides, as I said, he always chooses his field of battle. His key to victory was very simple. He always would try to divide his enemy or engage his enemy before they united with the majority of his forces. So even if the enemy was 3 times bigger than him, he would pounce on all the little parts of the enemy's force that was smaller than him until he defeated each one of them, and therefore he'd win the battle. Okay, so he always fought with odds in his favor, and we can see this throughout all his military campaigns. He used this strategy, and he did it because he had a whole network of military spies that went out and surveyed the land. The French at this period were some of the best geographers of Europe, so they had excellent surveyors. So he knew exactly where all the roads were, which roads were easy to travel on, which one were bad, which terrain was easy to walk across, which was not, where were the towns, where were the supplies. He even, many occasions, would send his agents in advance with vast sums of money and buy up all the food and store it in certain secret locations. So as the French army came through the area, it would have supplies and could continue going, because there was no modern supply method. So with a combination of these strategies, he would win all his battles. And he had a lot of personal experience as a military leader, where most of the commanders against him were chosen by kings or emperors because they were men of nobility, not because they had much experience in battle. And as the years go on, almost everyone gets terrified if they come up against Napoleon, because you would be defeated. And if you want to get an idea of a sense of what went on in Napoleonic warfare, I highly recommend the series in which Sean Bean appeared, produced by BBC TV. It wasn't BBC TV; it was a British channel, and which was like 14 or 20 part series about the campaigns, the British campaigns in Spain in 1813, 1815. It shows you what Napoleonic warfare was like and how much Napoleon was feared. And very accurate, historically very well done from almost every point of view. And Napoleon, after all these conflicts, just became absolutely famous. And fame during a revolution of chaos is power and is authority. So the more he won battles, the more he insisted on his way of things. And but during the whole time of all these conflicts, there was one power he never defeated, and that was the one power that had no troops, and that was the Pope. He met his match with Pius VII, one of the greatest popes of history, a man who had a fortitude that exceeded even Gregory VII, Hildebrand. And I see you have an image there of Venerable Pius VII. And most people don't know, but he was declared venerable by Pope Benedict in 2006 or 7.
Yeah.
And the fact that Pope Benedict declared him venerable was actually quite a thing, because he's considered politically incorrect, because he was an enemy of the French Revolution. And he was intransient, absolutely intransient, even when he had no allies at all, and was a prisoner. He resisted every single thing and constantly was making excuses not to obey Napoleon. And Napoleon just couldn't. Napoleon wasn't such an evil man like Adolf Hitler or other crazy nuts in the world like Stalin or Mao Zedong. Napoleon could not bring himself to harm the Roman pontiff, even though he had given up the Catholic faith and religion. And that, we must say, is to his credit. Yeah. But for the most part, when his troops entered towns, they burnt churches, executed clergy, and destroyed monasteries. Although that was mostly at the beginning of the French Revolution, nevertheless, even under his command, that was the general thing. I mean, there are half of the stuff in the Louvre was stolen by Napoleon from different parts of Europe, and it's been never given back.
Yeah. So if you want to, do some good deeds, France, empty the Louvre.
Maybe we should say something about French nationalism and Napoleon.
Oh, yeah.
So it's understandable that a man who, at a certain level on military prowess, became a national hero of France, so I'd say of the revolution, not really of France, should be admired even to our day. And as a military strategist, he's admirable. That is uncontested. But the morality of war is found not only in how you fight it, but for what end you fight it. And his troops didn't, during war, as far as I know, did not commit war crimes. There weren't that kind of, his armies didn't fight that way. So you'd say from a military point of view, he's fought his battles in an honorable way, even if before or after his troops were ravaging the countryside. But why did he fight? Okay. Yes, he fought to defend France against many coalitions of the other kingdoms of Europe that wanted to restore the French monarchy and put down these revolutionaries who were just destroying up the whole social order of Europe. But that is not a just cause. a just cause would be fighting for law and right, honor and morality, not for a revolution that was anti-Christian, anti-French, anti-European, anti-everything in Europe, led by godless men. So he achieved a lot in defending that evil revolution, and therefore what he did was evil, okay? And therefore it should not be admired, okay? Uh, um, I mean, you could admire a surgeon for his ability to carefully dissect a body, but if he does it to a living person to torture him, you should not admire him, even though he might have been the greatest surgeon that ever lived from the point of view of his technical expertise. So this is one of the great tricks of the devil, to get us to look at only part of a certain aspect of a human activity and admire it so much that we abandon the greater questions of morality and the honor and service of God and the common good, or even justice to everyone else. So in a sane or Catholic sense of admiration, we cannot admire Napoleon, and he was not a hero of France. He was one of the great villains of French history, and shall always be such, no matter how much people might praise him.
I keep hearing that during all these battles all over the place, it seemed like everywhere you went, you had a mistress.
Yeah, so he was a lascivious man. Okay, not in the untoward sense that he did it out in the open, but he had he married, he kept a girl by the name of Josephine eventually, and she insisted on marrying him, so he was married in the Pope's presence to her. And later he attempts to divorce her, and he marries an Austrian princess to forge an alliance with Austria. So he was not a man who respected the marriage bed or had respect for the institution of marriage. He pretty much did what he wants. And we must remember now, Napoleon, though in many aspects of his life is considered a great man, he was actually a very short man. I think he was under 5 foot high. I think he was like 4'8" or 4'6". And so, as sometimes happens, some men who are not so tall try to compensate by being excessive in some characteristic to prove, to prove that they're men. And that probably had something to do with it, because he was certainly someone who thought he was far bigger and greater than he actually was.
In the picture, in the imitators, you see him hide one of his hands. What is that about?
He was injured. I think he was injured in the Battle of Toulon slightly. So he did have some problems with that arm, and so he had to hold it up like that. I'm not totally familiar about his other medical conditions he might have had, whether it was a lung problem or stuff like that, or he had indigestion and things like that. So, but it became like the hallmark of Napoleon, okay? And some people say it was a Masonic symbol, but it was because he had health problems that he had to put his hand in there. Well, if you said so, from Treppers or something like that. So you always see Napoleon with his hand in his coat like that. And but the paintings of Napoleon always make him look a lot taller than he was.
Mm-hmm.
They'll never paint him the true size next to those around him, because he was rather squat. It's kind of like President Roosevelt. In the Second World War, no one knew President Roosevelt was in a wheelchair. And they didn't know it for years even later, because it was a closely guarded secret. He was always shown standing next to someone or next to people of similar height who was actually in a wheelchair the whole war. I think it was polio he suffered from. So he cultivated his image quite well. He hired the best artists to paint him. There's a famous painting of his coronation where he takes the crown and crowns himself rather than having the Pope do it. And the painter of that, I forget his French name, paints him as a man of great stature and height, when actually he was just a little man. And if you saw him doing the outrageous things he was doing as a short man, it'd become even more laughable, not because it's shameful being short, but just because of the exaggeration of the idea he had of himself, though he was of no notable blood or even intellectual refinement, although he was brilliant in his own way.
So when did he go into Egypt and attack there?
So that campaign was early on. So after his victories against the First Coalition, he comes back to Paris and he's hailed as a victor. So he's pretty much can do what he wants. So he proposed to the Directory that to make the Mediterranean, to extend French power in the Mediterranean, to take key strongholds that the British were using. And one was to his campaign to Egypt, whereby he landed at Malta and conquered Malta and put an end to the Knights of Malta, and prevented the British from using that, and went on to Cyprus and Egypt. And from the point of view of, and here I'll make a side, archaeology, since I studied anthropology, which is a field in which archaeology has its home, his trip to Egypt opened up a tremendous interest in the West in the study of archaeology and the origins of the ancient civilization of Egypt. No doubt, perhaps, also because the Freemasons claimed to be the heirs of the pagans of old, and investigating the Egypts was a way of ancient Egypt was a way of studying a society which was entirely pagan and entirely morally and religiously corrupt. But it was on that trip that key discoveries were made, and he made a quick job of conquering all the forces on land. The British hit him on his weak point by destroying his navy in the harbor of Alexandria, which kind of landlocked his forces in Egypt. And then the Ottoman Empire declared war on France as an ally of Britain, but he defeated the Ottomans in Syria and then came back to Egypt and defeated the British. But he still didn't have a navy, and there was no way to get his men back to France. So he caught a ship and he fled back to France with just his high officers. And the rest of his army was left to starve to death in Egypt. This is one aspect of his career that almost no one talks about, because it doesn't make him appear to be as great as some people want him to be. A commander never abandons his men, and he abandoned his men for the sake of his career. And
I mean, wow. I mean, you could have flagged down however many ships it took. I mean, surely he had money on him, right?
That's the thing that. Well, no, because the French surprised his fleet in the harbor of Alexandria and destroyed most of the French navy. They no longer had the power to maintain safety to bring the men back. At that point, what they should have done is sign an armistice with Britain, ceded something back, which they didn't want to do, and then bring the men back. But they weren't. The government in France, the revolutionary government in France, didn't care about the French soldier. It only cared about its agenda. Okay, so they didn't do that, and he didn't do that. But here we see that brilliant military leader he was in matter of strategy and tactics. He was a horrible commander because he abandoned his men and didn't really care about his men. And he was just a careerist. His ambition was only about himself, and anyone else he was willing to sacrifice. This is the aspect of Napoleon, which needs to be emphasized, because that's why that's why, as a man, even on the natural level, he is not admirable at all. He betrayed the trust his men put in him, even though they are the ones that gave him victory.
Sounds like so many journals today.
Yeah, I mean, godless from that point of view, the Freemasons are ultimate practitioners of this. They'll use anyone for their ends, and they don't care. They have absolutely no shred of compassion for those who they use for their victory.
What was the French coup of November 1799?
So While Bonaparte was in Egypt, the revolutionary government in Paris provoked serious troubles by starting to persecute viciously the Catholic Church. They deported priests. In Belgium, 6,000 priests were arrested and put to death. In Vendée, Normandy, and other departments of France, rebellions were breaking out. The people were uneasy throughout the whole country. Such disorders broke out in Paris that a prominent politician was assassinated in the very house of Napoleon's brother. So Bonaparte comes back to Paris and he takes control, because this is just, Napoleon was a man who wanted everyone beneath him to be under control, to be, he was a military commander. He expected the men beneath him to respect authority and be controlled, because a military as an institution is by its very nature monarchical. You can't win a battle with an egalitarian military structure. It just doesn't work that way, at least in classical warfare. And so he comes back, and with his fame of having won in Egypt and all his other battles, he takes control. So he breaks up the political group, the legislature called the 500. He suppresses the constitution that the Directory had imposed on France, and he names 3 consuls to rule France. So it's kind of like he returns to the classical republican idea of ancient Rome, where the triumvirate ruled. And of course, he was the first consul of France. So this is year 7 of the revolution, because remember, the revolutionaries abolished the Christian calendar. It wasn't 1799, it was the year 7. And he changes the government, and he puts in a new constitution. Administrators would be elected by citizens. Others were appointed by executive power, that is himself. He reorganized the judicial and financial administrations of France. He asked the Abbé Bernier, a French priest, to try to quell the religious rebellions in France by taking a more conciliatory position with Christianity. So with Napoleon coming to power, we see an amelioration of what was going on in France. Napoleon's government was not per se anti-Catholic, anti-Christian, or anti-Christic. He recognized that the Catholic religion was the religion of most Frenchmen, and that without religion there was no morality or order in society, and that the state could not govern unless people's religious beliefs were respected and fostered. And in his government in the early years, he goes so far as to promote some Catholic religious orders and fund many bishops, priests, and religious societies to do works of charity, and even form priests. He wanted priests that were going to be loyal to his authority and to what he would soon declare was the French Empire, with him as the emperor. So because he had these monarchical aspirations, and since he recognized that monarchy is best served by religion, he starts to end the persecution of the church. And this was a good and admirable thing, but he wasn't doing it because he loved God. It's because he had come to power. Okay, so any crook, when he comes to power, then realizes that he needs to obey laws, or at least the people do, because he doesn't want to lose what he has taken. And so that's like the natural cycle of things. Anyone who's a revolutionary and who wants to break laws, if he ends up in power, becomes the exact opposite of necessity, because he doesn't want anyone to do to him what he did to the previous rulers.
Yeah.
So he asked that the priests of France merely promise fidelity and laws to the Republic, and he wouldn't impose on them stricter obligations. He then fights a tremendous military campaign against what's called the Second Coalition, which was the coalition of governments of kingdoms of Europe against France. He entrusts the army of Germany to Moreau, the famous French cavalry officer. He took control of himself for the army of Italy. He crossed the St. Bernard Pass on the 13th to the 16th of May in 1800, and crushed the Austrians at the battles of Marengo and San Giuliano, on a very spot of the map that he had chosen months before. So he was a classic example. He knew where to engage the enemy. he caused Austria to conclude a peace of France, and he annexed to France large swaths of Italian territory. So he returns to Paris in 1801, and he reforms the government in some of its fundamental institutions. And from this, we have what's called the Code Napoleon. He establishes a new system of law based on Roman law with his modifications. If you've ever been to a big city and you see a very wide street that's like 8 lanes wide with 2 side streets and rows of trees, that is Napoleon, because the European cities were crowded and jammed and had narrow lands. He started urban reform, which opened up huge boulevards that usually went diagonally to everything else and allowed easy movement of traffic and military forces from one part of the city to the other, so that cities which used to be clogged points of the roadways became thoroughfares of traffic and commerce. So he had some very modern ideas when it comes to transportation, which were to the benefit of everyone. And those are some of the things. Code Napoleon is actually the fundamental laws, I think, of still the state of Louisiana, which once was a French possession, and meant all of France and its colonies and many other places that were once under French rule. He insisted the church would have a place in the new government, and he signed a concordant with the Apostolic See on the 17th of July, 1801. And he sets himself up as emperor. Let me look at the exact day. He comes, yeah, so he basically has from this point on complete and absolute authority over France, although his title is still first consul. He goes on, let me look at the exact year he declares himself emperor. I think it was in 1804, 1805. So for these 4 or 5 years now, he's calling himself first consul, but basically he has all the power. It's just a veneer.
And during this time, a holy priest is being formed. Saint Jean-Marie Vianney.
Vianney, yes. He grew up during the Revolution. He received confirmation in a barn because the Catholic faith was illegal. You couldn't celebrate in churches. Just as today in many countries, because of these crazy laws that outlaw the Mass because of this alleged pandemic, which doesn't exist, many Catholics are celebrating Mass now in private or secret places and in the countryside because they can't do it in public. They'd be arrested. And that was being done even in France. And Saint Jean Vianney is, we could say, is a patron for Catholics in such persecution, because he had no qualms about walking 20 miles and in a barn receiving the sacrament of confirmation.
Let's see. Did Christians face much persecution under Napoleon?
Once he comes to power, in the first years, actually there was, like, I would say, a cessation of persecution. He even restores certain religious orders and starts funding them, because, as I say, he had come to the possession of all authority, and so that he wanted a peaceful society. And those, you might even go so far, if you to use in an exaggerated sense, that from 1799 until like 1805, 1808, 1811 are the Catholic years of his reign, because persecution pretty much died out in a direct, open ways. People were not being executed for being priests or religious, and he wanted the priests who were hiding away to come back to their churches and celebrate Mass and serve the people. And he began a whole series of negotiations with the Pope, with Pius VII. And though he was always trying to force the Pope to do what he wanted, he never had the Pope physically manhandled or assassinated. He never even contemplated this assassination or a physical attack on the person of the Pope. And he always recognized the Pope as having authority, okay? And even in all the relations of the French that end up in the French government under Napoleon, no one's willing to actually attack the Pope. They're always saying, well, if we did that, we'd be schismatics because we would be doing it without the authority of the Pope. So France was still in her loins and her muscles as a corporate society, deeply Catholic and deeply faithful to the Pope. The France of 1800 is not the France of 2020. Okay, the people were deeply, even the most ardent pro-Napoleons were deeply religious people, and there was just so far they wouldn't go. And he spends the rest of his reign attempting negotiating with the church to get what he wants. He just didn't take it. Even at the end, when finally he, with Pius VII, he's taking authority to name bishops. It was never considered by the French Catholics to be anything valid or acceptable. So it's in a very different situation we have now, where people think, well, you know, if the state bans the mass, then that must be legal, and I should obey it. The Catholics today who follow the government in the banning or the restriction of the mass are not Catholic at all. They are worse than the Catholics of the French Revolution, who would not accept these kinds of intrusions into the affairs of the church, even if they were decreed by the force of an army. So this shows you how much people today who claim to be Catholic aren't Catholic in the least. Okay, they're willing to, you know, I hate to say it, and this is an exaggeration, but if Trump came out tomorrow and told Catholics to worship the Antichrist, I think a good number of Catholics would start worshiping the Antichrist, because they put more faith in Donald Trump than they put in Jesus Christ or in the institutions founded by Jesus Christ in the Catholic Church, because that's just how degraded people's concept of religion is. It's not the way it was even in the time of the French Revolution. But because he was always trying to get the Pope to agree to him, he never violated the principle that the Pope had authority. I mean, he made threats to dethrone the Pope, and so, but he never went through with it. He always had he recognized that the Pope had authority from heaven, and there was nothing he could do about that. And the only way he could get concessions from the church was negotiating it. And Pius VII was a brilliant man. He saw that in the character of Napoleon, and he realized that therefore he had won the battle, because all he had to do was buy time with Napoleon. Napoleon was a man, wasn't going to live forever. And if he just made up one excuse after the other, he wouldn't grant what Napoleon wanted. And that's what the position that Pius VII took, at great personal cost and of great suffering. But he held to his guns, and on this point, he defeated the most powerful man in Europe. Because Napoleon, for all his faults, would not cross the line and personally attack the institution of the papacy or the Roman pontiff, even though he imprisoned the Pope and held him prisoner at Savona on the south coast of France, near the French border. Still was trying to control the church, name bishops, priests, and things like that.
Topic going on today in the world: slavery. It was Napoleon for slavery.
Was Napoleon for slavery? That question I cannot answer. I'll say you caught me on one. So if you know the answer, let me know.
Well, I asked it because it was mentioned in Wikipedia, so I just thought it might have been in it.
I would tend to say probably wasn't, because the French Revolution was about liberation of everyone, but I can't answer that question. I know Pius VII was against it and condemned them. One of the leaders of the abolition movement was Pius VII. But
yeah, like everything you find in Wikipedia, take it with a grain of salt, folks. Why I put the question in? Might have been in his autobiography. It might have not been. Might have just been someone who just.
And what does Wikipedia say about Napoleon and slavery? That's an interesting question. We should at least air it.
Let's see. Where did I find it? Let's see here. Oh boy.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't find it.
Okay. Napoleon proclaimed himself hereditary emperor on the 30th of April of 18th of May, 1804. So from 1804 onward to 1815, he bears the title of emperor, and he establishes an imperial court. And You would think that with the revolution, people would be opposed to it, but he was so popular for all his victories and for his moderation, and he won over so many of the Catholics of France with his support of the church and end of persecution, that all hailed him as emperor. So here we have the irony of ironies, and usually revolutions of the more evil type always show themselves to be hypocritical. And here's a classic example. So the French Revolution is designed to get rid of the absolutionist authority of the French king, who was Catholic and whose family, through many generations, had governed France. But what do they end up with 15 years later? An emperor who has really no claim to govern the French, and is actually Corsican, not French, whereas at least the French royal family was French, okay, of the Frankish line, and who claims more authority than any French king. No French king claimed to be emperor, okay? No French king claimed the imperial title from the days of Charlemagne. Charlemagne was the arguments that Charlemagne himself didn't claim to be emperor, okay?
All right.
And that it became. So the French Revolution shows itself to be a complete fraud. And if you ever meet a Frenchman who's all behind the French Revolution, égalité, fraternité, blah, 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 then ask him if he approves of Napoleon declaring himself emperor. And he'll say yes, without realizing that he just undid everything himself. Because if everyone is equal, then you can't have an emperor. You have to have a democratic government where everyone is equal. But that's not the result of the French Republic. The French Revolution leads to absolute tyranny, because Napoleon claimed all authority for himself, which is even more authority than the French kings ever claimed, because the French kings claimed to rule by the grace of Jesus Christ and within the laws and traditions and customs of the French people. But Napoleon claimed his authority came from himself, because in the coronation ceremony, after hoodwinking the Pope to come to Paris to do it, he crowns himself. He takes the crown out of the hands of the Pope and he crowns himself emperor. So he's not going to be, his imperial authority doesn't come from God, it comes from himself. So what more outrageous contradiction of the entire, why did all those tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people who were guillotined in the French Revolution had to die, if 15 years later you have a worse state of affairs? Okay, so the coronation of Napoleon was not only a sign of his pride, it proved the French Revolution is a complete farce. And any French government today who says that we must preserve the values of the French Revolution are complete hypocrites.
Yeah, I totally agree. I found it. It mentions his role in the Haitian Revolution and the decision to reinstate slavery in France's overseas colonies are controversial and affect his reputation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so equality for everyone except for black people.
Yep.
So, whereas his opponent, Pius VII, issued many bulls against slavery and urged its abolition. So here we have the sense that shows you that the Catholic faith is not what the Masons say, a religion of repression and control. It's actually the religion of liberty, of order, of peace, of lawfulness and morality. And this is why evil men on all sides attack the Catholic Church, the papacy, and Roman Catholics everywhere. Catholics of any height, not just Roman Catholics. And you always have to look at that aspect to find out what's really going on, whether they're Marxists, communists, French revolutionaries, Freemasons. They all end up attacking the Catholic Church because we represent everything they want to destroy, and because they're of the devil and we are of God, and that's the real, that is the real narrative of history.
Yeah. Oh boy. Last night there's some tweet. Yeah, I was under the Donald Trump retweeting about Taylor Marshall, and they were like, and this one lady is like, I thought the Christians were also about converting by the sword. I was like, nope, that's Islam and still is today. It's like, but the Crusaders were too. I was like, nope.
Yeah, it's one of the old tricks of the Enlightenment to charge Catholics with all the crimes done by the enemy of Catholics. It's an old trick. The Crusaders had no intention of hurting anyone with a sword. Okay, matter of fact, nearly all the great Crusaders who were captured by Islam had their heads chopped off because they refused to convert to Islam. And there are many Crusaders who are not named as martyrs who died a martyr's death. The Crusaders' objective was merely to obtain the rights of Catholics to go on pilgrimage to the holy places. That was their fundamental objective. It wasn't about destroying Islam, conquering Islam, exterminating Muslims, genociding anyone. It wasn't about any of those things. And the church has never had anyone who has those intentions.
Hold on, folks. I think we lost a little bit. And let me check. You there? Brother Alexis, are you there? We just lost video with him. Okay. Okay. Let's see. And we were talking about how the Crusaders did not convert anybody by the sword, but how they died by the sword, and many are not on the martyrs list. And he's rejoining, and he's back.
Hello. I guess I said something that was unapproved of.
Yeah, how Crusaders didn't convert anybody by the sword, and how they lost their heads and aren't named in the martyrology.
Yeah, definitely unapproved language. Hopefully this won't interrupt the video and audio and leave it in a single track, but we'll see. Otherwise you have to post a part 1 and part 2.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, and let's see, why did he go all the way to Russia?
So before the war breaks out with Russia, Napoleon has conquered all of Germany. He has twice or thrice defeated Poland, Austria and Prussia. He has conquered all of Italy. He has conquered Spain. Okay. So he has conquered more territory than any man in European history. It goes to his head.
Wow.
And so he figures, well, now conquer Russia. Okay. He had massed huge military power. If he had not conquered Russia, he would have definitely won the war in Spain, even though the Spanish were very rebellious, to their credit. One of the few, I think the Spanish are the only nation in Europe in the Napoleonic Wars that puts forth solid, consistent, and determined resistance to Napoleon's conquest of their country. And that is to their immortal credit. But the Spanish have always been a feisty people. They wouldn't have reconquered Spain if they weren't. But his pride is just so much he can't see it. So he throws his entire military power to conquer Russia. And at this point, everyone in Europe knows you can't win Napoleon in an open battle. So the Russian Tsar, well advised, adopts a strategy that is brilliant. He withdraws from any battle with the French forces. And as his troops withdraw, they take away all the food or burn all the supplies. They devastate the country completely, and they tell the people to flee to other parts of Russia. So as the French army advances, it obtains nothing by its conquest other than wearing out its shoes and emptying its stomachs. So he wins a decisive battle at Borodin. and he goes to capture Moscow, because he figures if he captures Moscow, like all the other nations, once you capture their capitals, they'll surrender. Well, before he gets to Moscow, the Tsar orders the city burnt to the ground, and they burn Moscow to the ground. Moscow was a wooden city. And when the French forces arrive, there's nothing there. You can't spend the winter in a half-ruined city that's burnt down. There was no food to eat. How could you supply an army of tens of thousands? So he has to withdraw. And as his army withdraws back to Poland, the Russian winter sets in, and his men, who didn't have any kind of winter supplies because Napoleon did not properly prepare for this campaign, freezes to death. He loses most of his men. And the French army, which began at about 1 million strong, returns back to Poland, I think, at like only 25,000 or 50,000 men. So his decision led to the deaths of nearly 1 million French and French allies. It was a horrible tragedy, but it was a brilliant military strategy of the Russian Tsar, which was used again in the Second World War against Hitler very effectively, and also won the war against them, because Russia can always retreat further east, and as long as the Russians don't give up, they can win. So what the Russians were doing militarily is what Pius VII was doing ecclesiastically. As long as you don't surrender, you can defeat Napoleon. And they chose that strategy, and they saved Orthodox Russia from the depredations of Napoleon.
Then, let's see here. Let's see here. His alliance between him and the Turks in India against the British.
The British. Okay, so the British in the Mediterranean were the military power. Them and France and the Ottomans. The Ottoman state had been growing weak. In subsequent decades, we'll see that they start losing territory in the Balkans. But they wanted Egypt, and once the French had dislodged or the British from Egypt, the Ottomans quickly made an alliance with England against France so that they could expand their authority in the Mideast. And in subsequent decades of the 19th century, we'll see that the Ottomans go a couple times to war with Egypt, and Egypt becomes an independent nation and sets itself up and breaks away from Ottoman rule, and then the Ottoman Empire starts falling to pieces. But Napoleon allied with the Ottomans because it was to his advantage. The French, the French had really no military objectives or political objectives in the Balkans, so it wasn't a conflict. But France and the Ottomans were longtime allies. Even during the Battle of Lepanto, the French kings did not send any naval forces to the battle because they were allied with the Ottomans in such wise that they wouldn't help the Catholic Navy. So the victory of the Catholic forces at Lepanto in 1571 over the Ottomans, there was no Frenchmen there, and because the French had agreed not to help the Catholic forces because they were allied with the Ottomans, which is really a very bad policy and probably merited the loss of a lot of favor for France because it was the cause of Christ the Catholics are falling for. But other than that, the Ottomans didn't really have any substantial military power, and they couldn't really help the French in anything.
Then we get to a little bit of American history. The Louisiana Purchase.
Yeah, so by the time the Louisiana Purchase comes about, Napoleon's desperate for cash and gold. They didn't use paper money back then. And so France had all these territories in North America, at least a legal claim to them. And so Napoleon needed a quick sum of money. I think it was, 5 million French francs or US dollars, and sold most of North America to the American government, which pleased them very much and was very influential in the growth of the United States. So when you see places called Louisiana or St. Louis or Illinois, you are seeing the fingerprints of the old French Empire in the Midwest. And most of all the place names and all the rivers were named after Catholic saints or Catholic things. and many of them who subsequently changed by Protestants because they didn't want to be living on the river of the Most Blessed Sacrament, or Our Lady of the Our Lady of Martyrs or something like that. So if you're Catholic, you might want to look into the history of your own state and remember these Catholic names and speak of them with their proper term when you're crossing that river or looking at that mountain or entering that city. But it was providential that Napoleon wanted to sell those lands and that America bought them up. Perfectly legal in its way. Well, unless you claim Napoleon had no right to govern France, and that is true too. But it was a sale that was recognized by all subsequent French governments as legitimate.
Yeah. No, I think, was it Thomas Jefferson was the president, and in that same miniseries about John Adams, you see a great change in Thomas Jefferson from when he was writing the Declaration of Independence, how he was wanting to free America from Britain in that document, and also the parts that were changed so that Georgia, South Carolina, and those southern states would join in. He wrote in about the freedom of slaves. Now, when it comes time after the Constitution was ratified and made vice president of John Adams, his whole demeanor changed from true notion of liberty and freedom to being fully supportive of the French Revolution. And just like a complete change in tone and how mad he was about that. He was like one of the revolutionists from France, is how crazy they were.
Well, the Masons hated monarchy, and a lot of Protestants were anti-Catholic. They had learned that bigotry from their ancestors because anti-Catholic bigotry was promoted in England as a way of justifying the Reformation and the theft of all the ecclesiastic property there. So once you steal it, you hand down to all generations thereafter some lie to justify your theft. And since you're living on land stolen from others, especially from things that belong to God, if you don't repeat the lie, you have to give back the land. So it's kind of like enslaves all your ancestors and descendants to a lie and to a crime. But the French Revolution was very popular outside of France. A lot of people became Bonapartists. They're thinking Napoleon was a great man and what France was doing was a great thing. And it's kind of like a soccer game. If one team is really succeeding, everyone starts cheering for them if they have no loyalties one way or the other. And I think Jefferson fell into that error. Jefferson had his own skeletons to hide because he was having children by his black slaves, and so he becomes more in favor of black slavery because he's trying to hide his own sin, because otherwise he'd have to recognize those children as his heirs, and there was still a strong notes of ignobility to that sort of thing back then, not only out of wedlock but interracial. And so he was not the man people thought he was by writing all those political slogans in the Declaration of Independence, okay, or in the Constitutions.
Yeah.
And that's true. That's true of any revolutions not done explicitly in the name of Christ. The American Revolution was not done out of the love of Jesus Christ or for the honor and glory of Christ's kingdom. It was not. And so consequently, not everyone in it had the highest motives. But Napoleon was very much admired outside of France. And we have to remember that England the English crown was very much hated in the US after the American Revolution. And even in 1812, the British returned and burnt down the White House. So much so that even up until I think 1925, the US military had plans on what to do if the British should invade America. So it was like, it was deeply ingrained in the American psyche that Britain was the enemy. So if France was defeating Britain in battle after battle on land and sometimes at sea, you could see why some Americans could become champions of French and also of Napoleon. But also we have to remember that Lafayette, who fought with the American revolutionaries, goes on and becomes a revolutionary himself, although I think he ends up guillotined. A lot of Americans who had contacts with Frenchmen end up in their own personal sentiments to admire the French Revolution for good reason or ill, mostly ill.
Yeah. That's sad. Then he goes, let's see. When was the Battle of Waterloo? And everything leading up.
Okay, so once Pope Pius VII effectively resists all Napoleon's attempts to grab power from the church, it becomes quite well, and once the Spanish have shown effective resistance to the French military, that encouraged even the Russians. So with the Spanish having defeated the French and Pius VII having defeated Napoleon and the Russians having defeated Napoleon, the power of the French state begins to wane. The allies of France outside of France realize that it's time, Napoleon is going to last forever, it's time to switch sides. And at some important battles, German allies switch sides during the battle and Napoleon starts losing. So by 1814, 1812, his situation is pretty stark. And the armies against him, the Allies now start raising huge amounts of military troops against him. Before that, when he defeated them in the early parts of his career, they had not undertaken a modern military reform, so they weren't even as well armed. But by 1810, 1812, the Prussia, Russia, and the Austrians have reformed their army and organized them in a modern way. And so they're now prepared to take the field against Napoleon. And his strategy, which won him all the battles, namely of attacking the enemy's forces when they're smaller than yours, doesn't work when you have, 100,000 and your enemies have 1 million. Because how could you find any part of them that's smaller than yours? You can't. So they learned that lesson too, to keep their forces, to move in force and not separate them across the countryside, so Napoleon could pick them off. So he is, let me get the dates right. Okay, so we're in the year of, let me get the date right. The year of 1813, okay. He is, three armies were formed against France. That by Schwarzenberg, the Austrian, that of Blücher, of the Prussians, and that of Bernadotte, who was who had switched sides. Napoleon had 280,000 men in the field. His enemies had 500,000. He defeated them at Dresden on the 27th of August, but his generals started deserting him. His Bavarian allies at the Battle of Nations at Leipzig on 18th and 19th of October deserted and so did the Württembergers and the Saxons, and led to his defeat at that battle. He won the battles of Hanno on the 30th October and Hochheim on the 2nd of November, but these only enabled his troops to withdraw to France. After that, the Allies had their hands. And so he defeated them in a winter battle, the 27th, 29th of January, 1814 at Saint-Désert-en-Brouillan. And the Allies offered peace if he should just reduce the size of France to its pre-revolutionary boundaries. He did not accept that. And the Allies demanded the liberation of the Pope because he still held Pope Pius VII a prisoner. So, and Napoleon relented to that, and he allowed and he ordered his men to release the Pope in Italy. War was resumed after the Congress of Chatillon. In 5 days, Napoleon gave battle to the Prussian Blücher 4 times at Champaubert, Montmirail, Château-Thierry, Avauchamp. He defeated them at Chalons. Against the Austrian general Schwarzenberg, he fought the battles of Guiches, Mormant, Nangy, and Mary. But the Austrians invaded France and took Lyon. Bordeaux was taken by the English. The Allied coalition now is inside French territory and is starting to whittle away his power base. He defeats Blücher again at Craon on the 7th of March, and he retakes Reims and Epernay. He decrees a general levy of the French people to mass as many armies as possible, but the Allies already had their agents throughout France and prevented the levy from being effective. The Allies' forces on the 31st of March enter Paris. On the 3rd of April, the French Senate declares Napoleon dethroned. He returns to Fontainebleau, his residence, and one of his generals, Mormant, intercepts him and arrests him and prevents him from going. On the 20th of April, he left Fontainebleau. On the 4th, he was in Elba. So he flees to the island of Elba, which is a little island off the coast of Tuscany in the Mediterranean, and there he ends up imprisoned under the British Guard. So that's 1814. Louis the 18th is restored. So Louis the 18th is, you will probably correct me on this. Can you, I just want to make sure you can still hear me.
Yeah.
Okay. So Louis the 18th, you correct me on this, whether if he was the son or the nephew of the previous Louis the 16th. I'll let you correct me on that. He resets up a new government, and since the new government wanted to restore the whole monarchical system, it becomes quickly very unpopular, and rebellions start breaking out in France because they had lived now for 25 years, nearly 25 years, no, 23 years under a new way of living where the monarchy didn't exist, and to actually go back and restore it was something that the French people didn't want. So with his allies, he escapes from Elba and he returns to France. He marches triumphantly throughout the country, and the people rally to him. Okay, he arrives in Paris on the 20th of March. Louis the 18th flees to Ghent, and then begins a period called the 100 Days. And in these 100 days, Napoleon attempts to reestablish the empire and win back the independence of France for the revolution. He granted the country a constitutional government by the Acte Additionnel, and he wrote in a very humble, peaceful way to Pius VII. But the Allies formed a new coalition against him. He raised 118,000 of his loyal French Guard, the veterans who really wanted Napoleon to return. But the Allies massed 800,000 soldiers against him. He beats Blücher at Ligny on the 16th of June, while his general Ney defeats Wellington at Quatre Bras. The next day at the Battle of Waterloo, this is 1815, Napoleon was victorious over Bülow and Wellington until 7 o'clock in the evening. But then there arrived 30,000 Prussians under Blücher, and this crushed the French forces. The Imperial Guard, the finest of Napoleon's units, was thrown into the battle at the last moment, and even they couldn't hold back the Allies. And at that, Napoleon flees the field, and he abdicated in favor of his son, and he sets out for Roquefort, where he flees to the English lines and asks for sanctuary. The English imprison him, and against his will, take him as a prisoner to the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he remains a prisoner for life because they didn't want this guy to come back to France. So that was the Battle of Waterloo. Battle of Waterloo is one of the great military battles, it was a classic case of Napoleon attempting his strategy again. If he could just defeat each of the three Allied armies independently, the English under Wellington, the Austrians, and the Prussians, he could win the battle, and that was his strategy. The only problem is that the Prussians, who was trying to hold off, arrived too soon. So instead of being where the enemy wanted him to be, he moved his forces against one of the Allied forces and tried to defeat them, preventing the Prussians, who were on the other side of the field, of arriving. Because if he had stayed in a central position, the Allies would have been able to hit him at the same time. So he moves his forces to a side to attack one at a time to hold off the Prussians. But the Prussians force march through the night and arrive in the evening, and his forces, wearied by so much fighting already, couldn't take the attack and assault of fresh troops. So that's the Battle of Waterloo. Wellington is considered a victory. Wellington goes on to become a duke, and his name is lauded in British history. I think he goes on to become Prime Minister of England for many a year, and launches a political career for Wellington, Duke Wellington. And there are even certain ways of preparing meat. Calling Wellington, beef Wellington is a way of cooking a roast of beef, I believe. And that's where Napoleon was defeated, and that's where the golden standards of the Imperial Guard were captured. And you can see that battle recounted in that series with Sean Bean in it from British television on the French Napoleonic Wars. So you will hear Waterloo mentioned many times. Waterloo is a place in Belgium, modern-day Belgium, and I believe it's on the west side of Belgium, in the area of Flanders. Waterloo, you can see by its place name, and it was kind of a varied terrain, covered with trees and open fields, so you couldn't see all the forces of your enemy at once.
Yeah.
There, Napoleon is defeated, and there his power comes to a definitive end.
Mm. You're listening to Order Militaris Radio TV live on radio, and soon we'll be able to have the video up on YouTube and BitChute. If you like what you're hearing, go to ordo-militaris.net. Please click any of the show topics and support us that way by scrolling down to make a free will monthly subscription, and click the blue-green button and follow the steps. And in Iowa, there's a town called Waterloo where the John Deere has a combine factory where the John Deere implement haulers go to get new combines and stuff and haul them back to their stores.
Probably, I'm not saying it was named, I don't know the history of the town, but I would bet it was named by someone who was like an Anglophile, and he was proud of the victory of the Allies there at the Battle of Waterloo.
Yep, and Louis the 18th is the brother of King Louis the 16th, and nephew of Louis the 17th. And yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
He lived in exile in Prussia, Russia, England, and yeah. And when Napoleon escaped Elba, he went back on exile until he was defeated again, and he ruled as the king for slightly less than a decade. The government was the Bourbon Restoration, was a constitutional monarchy. And it was reduced quite a bit by the Charter of 1814, which then France's new constitution and his return in 1815 led to a second wave of white terror headed by the ultra-royalist faction, whatever that was.
Yeah, the when he first came back to power, Louis XVIII, a lot of royalties, that is French, who wanted the restoration of the monarchy, they wanted revenge on all these horrible crimes committed under the revolutionaries. And um, they didn't show political prudence, because to rule you must win over the hearts of the people. But to get back to our main topic, Napoleon not being a man to admire, we can see now that how haughty and high was his pride, how he believed that he himself was sufficient in his abilities to rule all of Europe and to remain in power and to establish kings and dynasties and govern the church. And he didn't succeed. And in his deathbed there in St. Helena, he comes to realize that everything he did, no one remembers anymore, but the church remains, and Jesus Christ has had the victory. And so he realizes where true power comes from, and that he didn't have that. His way of doing things did not succeed in the end. And so the life of Napoleon, even though he's not admirable as a hero, studying the life of Napoleon is a valuable lesson to anyone, every Catholic, and anyone studying politics or military strategy. What the things most important are the things most powerful. God, the Catholic faith, these things you cannot destroy, and if you rail against them, you will be destroyed. Those who accept these things and build their house of God on that rock, there is their works that remain forever. So that is the great prudence, and Napoleon teaches us that in a contrary sense. You can be, and so Napoleon's defeat is really a rebuke to all those who rise up after him, like Adolf Hitler, Stalin, Mao, all these men who have attempted to do horrible things, and nothing ever came of it other than killing innocent people. And the Chinese Communist Party will learn that, that their wickedness and their pride will end up destroyed one day because they rail against Christ and his church. They think they have won, but they have not won. And likewise, all other dictators who have ever lived. Fidel Castro died, and nothing will ever come of his revolution. Cuba will go back to being a Catholic country, and many other nations where they tried to establish communism, like Angola or Nicaragua. You can't destroy Christ or his church. These things are eternal, because God is eternal and the church is founded on God. And so it's through the office of Peter. And it's a good rebuke to Catholics who think that they can have a church without the true Pope, and that they can have a church based on the opinion of cardinals who think that they're infallible, though canon law gives them no authority whatsoever to say anything about a papal resignation, whether it be valid or not. They have absolutely no authority whatsoever. And so if they presume to do anything, they err. And those of us Catholics who follow the law and know that we have just as much right to say an apple is an apple as, actually we have more right to say an apple is an apple than all the cardinals to claim that it's an orange. And so the cardinals will be dashed. Bergoglio will be dashed upon the rock of God, because they rail against God, and they rail against the one who has the office of Peter, Pope Benedict. And all the Catholics who unite with them shall also be dashed upon the rocks of history, because God and his plans alone prevail. And so Napoleon's life, though he himself is not admirable as a hero, teaches us a very important lesson that we need to hear today.
I was just thinking back when you were talking about how the Spanish are feisty people, and I was like, I mean, you're supposed to be a great military guy, and you didn't study his history, how the Spanish didn't give in to the Moors and kicked them out of Spain?
It was the atheism and the anti-Catholicism of the French that really alienated the Spanish. They also, you got to remember, the Spanish had been ruled by Spanish monarchs, and then the throne was inherited by the Habsburgs, who were an Austrian family, and then it was inherited by the Bourbons. But to be taken over by a Corsican who claimed to be emperor, that was just too much. The Spanish weren't going to have it, an anti-Catholic one too. and he set up his brother on the throne of Spain and deposed the Bourbon. And the Spanish were very loyal to the Bourbon monarch. So, in fact, the Bourbons still govern Spain to this day, although not through in my opinion, the legitimate claimant. So, yeah, the Spanish showed true loyalty to their king, but the revolution didn't begin in Spain, and so it was never seen as a Spanish thing, although they had strong allies. And in the post-Napoleonic period, we see that the French revolutionaries who spread their errors and lies in Spain end up causing a tremendous conflict in Spain. Spain will have 3 civil wars in the 19th century and a terrible civil war in the 20th century, inspired by the ideas of the French Revolution that tries to attack the concepts of monarchy and Christianity, things that are the foundations of Spanish society, history, culture.
Yeah. Would it be fair to say that what we're seeing in the big cities in America are same things from the French Revolution and the time of Napoleon being played out again?
In a way, because both the Democrat and Republican parties, the whole political system in America is founded on trying to run a country without the explicit loyalty to Jesus Christ or service to Jesus Christ. And every year, the American government attempts to attack more and more the Christian character of the nation. And we spoke at this at length on does America need a Christian party, and addressed it more specifically. But yeah, America will learn its lesson too. Because if you raise your hand against God, you will be destroyed. And that is why Christians in America, if they want to save their nation, need to organize a Christian party, because otherwise America will be destroyed and conquered by her enemies, whether from within or without or both.
Mm-hmm.
Because no nation that attacks Christ and turns against him will remain standing.
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to add?
The French need to have a change of heart, and as a nation, undo the French Revolution. Okay, so Napoleon, the other lesson we learned from Napoleon is that the French Revolution was a complete bunch of lies. It's still a bunch of lies. It never had anything to do with helping everyone. It made Napoleon emperor. It killed millions of Frenchmen. And to what end? Okay, so no matter how corrupt or unjust you felt the French monarchy was, or the Ancien regime, you certainly can no way say what happened during the French Revolution after was more just. Okay, was the French monarchy excessively opposed to those political and economic reforms that would have brought about a more just and Christian order in an age in which the economy was shifting from the mercantile class and the agricultural class to the industrial class, and with all the new innovations that were about to break forth? Yes, they were. Could have that been changed through peaceful means? Yes, it could have. Were the corrupt ministers of Louis XVI much at fault? Yes, they were. But if you're going to solve a problem, you direct your efforts to the problem, not to destroying, not to destroying the house. If there's a problem in the kitchen, you don't burn the house down. Okay. So the French Revolution was completely unnecessary, and it is actually a false solution to the modernization of France. And so many evils come from it. First of all, the political class ruling France is not French. It's anti-French, and it's completely Masonic. The French Masons control, I think, something like 2/3 of the seats in Parliament, even though they're less than 1% of the population. So as a Frenchman, you're not getting what they promise you. They promise that it's a democracy and you have equal rights. No, you don't. Because if you had equal rights, then the Catholics would have a majority seats in Parliament today. Okay, but they don't, they never have, and they never will, so long as the government is constantly proclaiming the revolution, which is complete attack on the people of France. So the French people need to snap out of the lies and propaganda of the revolution, and they need to organize themselves in the country all around France. Because if you look at a political map of France, you will see that the countryside does not want the revolution even today. It doesn't even want the ruling government, and it certainly doesn't want Macron. And so you should organize a true revolution, and that is to turn France back into a French nation, a Christian nation, a nation that's truly for everyone and not for the Masonic sect. The Masonic sect needs to be disassembled, arrested, and either sent into exile or put in prison, because they are a plague on the French nation. They have destroyed that nation's culture, that nation's art, that nation's religion, that nation's spirit. France was always a very powerful and victorious nation. But once the Masons get in control, they lose all their wars. They lost the War of 1870 and they lost the War of 1914. Well, not 1914, they nearly lost if the Americans didn't join, but they definitely lost the War of 1939. So the French Revolution has made France the loser, not the victor. France was always strong and won its wars, but after the French Revolution, she loses it because she no longer has God's favor. She's trying to, the French government tries to think that virtue comes from vice, and it doesn't work that way, okay? And evil is not more powerful than good. Good is. So, but the French need to unite in that thing. You need to snap out of this idea that the Republican Party or the Nationalist Party or the any other socialist, non-Christian, or even monarchical party is going to save you. You need a Christian party, okay? And you have to recognize that the good of France doesn't necessarily mean restoring the monarchy, but it certainly means restoring a Catholic state, okay, a Christian state, a French state, and a French and Christian form of government. And it certainly means opposing the revolution and all the revolutionaries. So you need to, the French people need to organize, and they need to take every effort, lawful or just, to attain that end. Fighting every political battle necessary, every legal battle necessary, and to a great part, simply ignoring the French central government. And even if you must bring down that government by massive national strikes or anywhere the others. So, Order Militaris Catholicis, we're not into promoting revolution. But as a friar, I'm obliged to tell you the truth in all matters. And Catholics and all people of honesty and right reason need to oppose the whole concept and spiel of the French Revolution, which is just one big lie to put a bunch of greedy, immoral, atheistic, and perverse men in power and steal that which belongs to the French from the French, and that is the right to be governed by Frenchmen and Christians, not by godless, anti-French atheists, okay? And you have to unite. You can't let yourself be separated by all these false oppositions that achieve nothing in the end, okay? So like in the last election for the French president, one of Macron's biggest opponents filled all her regional power bases, placed in power homosexuals and sodomites who want the perverse gay liberation to go forward. So how do you save France from the revolutionaries if you try to win it with your own forces controlled by even more perverse revolutionaries? So she merited to lose and she lost. Mm-hmm. And that should show Catholics that you can't follow a false opposition. You must start with sound Catholic principles. They're not based on the loyalty to an individual who can sell you out, but to Jesus Christ, who is alone worthy of trust. So that's what the French need to do. And that's the lesson they should learn from Napoleon. Unite your forces and attack the enemy where he's divided. Don't let him divide you and attack you where you're divided.
I would say that lady, her niece, Marion Marshall, is way more Catholic than her aunt and a lot more voiceful. She risked a lot of stuff just to travel to America, speak that one year. And boy, did she let them have it. She said exactly what you said.
Well, so the French need to imitate what's strong and stop being, stop pretending there's not a problem in France. And France, like Russia, has spread its errors around the world. So a Frenchman who knows what the problem is and doesn't do anything about it becomes, by his non-action, guilty in all the errors that the French are spreading around the world. and it's an absolute solemn duty of every French Catholic to oppose the revolution. And anyone who says otherwise is a traitor to France and to Jesus Christ.
Yeah. This has been a very good show. Um, please go to our YouTube channel or BitChute channel, Mixcloud channel. Listen or watch the program on the Christian Party show. Share it. It's needed today, not just in America only, but pretty much everywhere in Europe, except I would say at least Hungary's pretty darn Christian in its party.
And you can find links to those channels for Ordo Militaris Radio TV at the footer of the ordo-militaris.net page.
Yeah, giant photo links, folks. Nice, easy to see. Yeah. I thank you for being on again, Brother Alexis.
Thank you, AJ. It's always a pleasure to talk about these things and help Catholics get a truly Catholic vision of the world and of history and of these issues.
Tomorrow's show, not sure what time yet, folks, is on Catholic clergy working as Nazi spies.
Yes, that will be fascinating. You got to turn in. This is the history no one ever told you about and that you need to know.
Mm. This is Ordo Militaris Radio signing off. Deus Volt.
Deus Volt.